It is December here at the Phish Bowl, and today we are closing the books on a truly consequential year. 2025 was the year the attackers stopped knocking and started walking right through the door. We saw critical infrastructure get probed like never before. We saw developers feel the immediate nuclear ripple effects of supply chain compromises like that major NPM incident, which we'll talk about. And the common thread, it wasn't some newfangled firewall bypass, it was the weakest link: compromised identity. Reused passwords, stolen credentials, and social engineering that simply walked past technical defenses. So, what does that mean for 2026? We're connecting the dots on how this year's biggest trends are shaping the future. I'm your host, Jordan Sher, and to break down the winners and losers in the fight for our security and our souls, I'm here with the best in the business. LastPass threat intelligence experts Stephanie Schneider and Mike Kosak, and our special guest, Alex Cox, Director of Threat Intelligence for LastPass, who's here to talk about threat predictions and serve as our resident threat futurologist. So let's get into it. But before we begin, Steph, I caught your article this morning on marathon training and what it taught you about your job. And it makes me wonder, do you feel like this job is a marathon to you?
Well, Jordan, I willingly sign up and run marathons all the time. So I have to say I enjoy it. So yeah, I don't think it's a bad thing to say that I think of this job as a bit of a marathon, because I think there's a lot of crossover and connection between that endurance mindset when it comes to cybersecurity and showing up to the job day to day, and having that long-term motivation and plan in place to work towards just creating a secure future. So if we just show up every day and make the world 1% safer, better place, then that's a win in my book.
Yeah, and try to avoid bathroom accidents at every turn, right?
That's right. Yeah. Yeah. Fuel appropriately.
Fuel appropriately. I love it.
And stay hydrated, y'all. Keep drinking that water. It's good for you.
Fantastic. Well, it's a great piece. It's in today's Tech Radar. We are recording on December 4th, so take a look, and I really enjoyed it. It was awesome. But let's get into the content for today. So we're going to be talking about trends. I wanted to kind of start off, though, with a little holiday festive cheer. So obviously, holidays are always a big season, peak season for scams and scam actors. Can all three of you give me your hot take on what is the best revenue generating scam for criminals right now? And I want to start with Mike.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's a lot of it is just the classic uptick that we see around this year. There's the signal to noise ratio is all off because every website you visited, every shopping site you've gone to, every membership you have, you're going to get emails from them. So it gets easier to, one, bury malicious emails in that sort of, I guess, milieu of holiday cheer, for lack of a better way to put it. And so, you can kind of catch people unawares. So that's absolutely part of it. It makes it harder to discern what's good and what's bad in your inbox. And people are clicking on a lot of stuff that they wouldn't normally click on.
Yeah. Every scammer loves a good milieu, right?
Who doesn't really? It's not just limited to scammers. That's why milieus are so effective.
Exactly. The most effective scam. All right, cool. Steph, over to you.
Yeah. Well, I mean, these scams aren't just showing up in our inboxes anymore, right? More and more, we're seeing more mobile targeting. I'm on my phone a lot, and lately with Black Friday, I've just got inundated with tons of text messages. So, I know that there's a big uptick in smishing, with a lot of notifications pretending to be package deliveries that you need to take action on to accept, or whatever the prompt is. There's just a lot of targeting via mobile devices, because threat actors know that that's where our eyes and attention are on, and so we're seeing more of that. And especially when there's that built-in sense of urgency, that's a super common giveaway that, hey, like this could be a scam if they're asking you to take action, make a payment, do something with immediate urgency. Typically, that's a dead giveaway.
Yeah. I'd add toll collection too, especially to your point, Steph, when it comes to the smishing, especially as people are driving around more, you're traveling for the holidays. That was already highly prevalent this year, but I expect that'll take off too.
Toll collection. Say more about that.
Yeah, so just it's been really common for like the last 6 to 12 months. There's been a real push in people getting texts that'll say, this is Sun Pass or Easy Pass, and you have a balance on your account. Please log in here. So that's been part of this phishing targeting for some time, where they'll use that to collect credentials or try and get money.
Hmm. Yeah. So watch out for anybody asking for money like that. Alex, you had a really good point about topical scams that are happening in the news cycle. You want to talk more about that?
Yeah, I mean, so I'd start by saying, this time of year is one of the, bad guy greatest hits, and that's gift cards, right? Everybody gets gift cards this time of year, and the bad guys have always taken advantage of that. One of the things that I've seen that's topical that I thought was really pretty interesting is lure using tariffs, right? So you get a smish that says, hey, you've got this shipment, but there's some tariff, costs due. You need to pay it to get your shipment. So it shows, again and again that the bad guys are kind of paying attention to the news cycle, paying attention to the things that people are interested in or reading about, and then sort of using that, as lures. So yeah, the tariff thing has been interesting.
Yeah, I haven't heard of that before. I will be on the lookout for that. It's crazy. Great. Well, this is your friendly neighborhood reminder not to click on any link that you don't recognize, and watch out for those tolls. Nobody's probably trying to take tolls from you via your mobile device. So watch out for that. Awesome. Love to move now, looking forward into 2026, talking about some trends that we all think are on the horizon. One thing that I noticed, and maybe you all can corroborate this a little bit, every story we look at kind of comes back to this one overlying theme, which is compromised credentials. And we hear a lot, identity is the new perimeter, the new network perimeter. So given all that, why is the single reuse password still the most high value asset an attacker can steal? And if that's the case, and credentials are so critical in all of these trends, do you have some best practices or some guidance to share about that?
Well, compromised identities enable all sorts of attacks, and they're super valuable because once you have kind of the keys to the kingdom, you can unlock and do a whole lot of damage. And so really we see, compromised identities enable everything from ransomware attacks to data exfiltration. And compromised identities, unfortunately, are kind of everywhere, just between information stealers, which have exploded. That's a type of malware that specifically, goes after credentials and other valuable information that can be used to gain initial access. And then also just between all the massive data dumps that we see, there's, in one report recently over the last year, there was a report that 16 billion credentials were leaked, and that's just a huge number. That there's, that number 16 billion is a little bit misleading, because not all of those are unique credentials, but nonetheless, I think it just kind of highlights just how prevalent this issue is.
Do you think it is a problem in search of a tool, or is it a change in human behavior that needs to occur?
I think it's both. I think, yeah, I mean, that's obviously I'm a little biased on this one, but that's why we have password managers as a way to do this. But really, all of this is playing off, at least, and I think it's important to call out one thing that's really become clear over this last year, and Microsoft did a really good job calling this out in their digital defense report this year, on the idea that compromised identities and compromised credentials aren't just individuals, it's also applications. So that's part of it. There's a human and a non-human side of this. But when we look at the human side, there's the psychological aspects of it's hard for people to remember passwords, they want to reuse, and that's just part of it. So there's people aren't going to change that part of themselves. They're not going to start coming up with 32 character unique passwords for every single thing they have. So, there's the psychological aspect of it. So there do need to be tools, and there are tools for this. It's not just password managers. We see the move to passkeys as well, which is even more secure because they're phishing resistant. So it's really this sort of, there is a psychological aspect. There are technological responses and answers to that. It's just we're still working on adoption, and it just needs to be implemented more broadly, I think.
Yeah, I'd agree with the gang. There's a saying that we use in security that like one of the hardest systems to secure is the one that's between the keyboard and the chair. And humans tend to do human things, and they want to do things that are easy to remember and that sort of thing. So when we think about going to one of your employees or a user or what have you and saying, hey, don't reuse your passwords, they're probably going to do it anyway. And we need the technical means to kind of create enough friction there to make it so even if they make a mistake, they're still somewhat covered, or at least it's a little bit harder for the bad guys to operate. And if you think of the breach landscape and the way identity plays there, even the most technical hack has an identity component. And an example I'll use is like ATM jackpotting, right? When bad guys figure out some technical flaw in an ATM and they're able to make it spit out money, they're assuming the identity of the system that runs that ATM, right? So it's part of every single breach that we deal with. There's always an identity piece. So it's a really important part of a global or overall security posture is to think about that sort of thing.
Just building on what Mike and Alex were talking about in terms of just thinking about identity more broadly than just passwords, because Jordan, you asked, is a password the most valuable asset? And I would argue that no, a stolen password isn't the most valuable thing that a hacker can steal. It's actually, if we think about identity as a larger kind of environment, then we could even look at things like browser cookies being more valuable than a password, for instance, because of MFA. These are more valuable. And, if there's no MFA and a password gets stolen, a threat actor can access that account without much effort. But if they steal like a browser cookie, for instance, that enables them to get silent access to a system. It bypasses the need for authentication. That session cookie is already authenticated, so it doesn't trigger alerts. So I think kind of that is more dangerous. And if we just I think we need to kind of shift our thinking as security experts, and especially as end users, and think beyond just passwords.
So is that the trend for 2026, is to expand our definition of identity? Or what about all this? Everything you're telling me, I think, is a lot of common knowledge in the world of security. But the question then is, what is going to change in 2026 about any of this?
Well, I think we've already seen, like when we look at info stealers and how those have evolved, we've already seen info stealers kind of shift from just going after credentials to going after browser cookies, for instance, because hackers understand that is even more valuable, especially with the growing prevalence of multi-factor authentication.
I'll say, when we look at 2026 and how this will change, we've seen an increase in the adoption of passkeys, and I think that's really going to shape 2026 more and more. As more people pick that up, to Steph's point around session tokens, those become more valuable to threat actors because they can use those to bypass multi-factor authentication. It's already a validated session. So I think part of what we'll have to talk about more in 2026 is how session tokens are handled. What is the what's the timeline for revocation or expiration on those? There needs to be more attention paid to that because that will help protect customers and companies against that sort of next wave as threat actors focus more on those session tokens.
The next topic I wanted to discuss today is critical infrastructure that's been under threat. Obviously, utility systems, a great example of a target. And oftentimes, I think from a business perspective, we ask ourselves, like, does this matter? Has this any application to me? Is there a downstream effect in critical infrastructure being targeted by some of these threat actors that may impact businesses in the long run in 2026?
I think there's two aspects to that. One, companies need to look at their connections to critical infrastructure because they don't often think about that. They may be a second or third or fourth to your connection to critical infrastructure. So they may be a target themselves because they provide that entry point into an attack chain for a threat actor to get into a critical infrastructure organization. There's also the other element of course, the reliance of all of these companies on critical infrastructure. So, if anything ever goes high order, there's that aspect of it. And then as well, if we look at some of the conversations that took place last year, or maybe it was the year before, I guess it was last year, where China had so heavily targeted and infiltrated telecoms that the FBI had to warn literally the entire United States that if you want to have secure communications, use something like Signal, then, that's just another demonstration that you can't even trust necessarily, or at least for that time period, the general telecommunications sector to communicate your intellectual property and proprietary information securely. So they absolutely need to take that into consideration.
Yeah. These are foundational systems that have huge downstream effects across both business and the general public, is what I'm hearing, right?
Absolutely.
Critical infrastructure is really an interesting threat area because it's one of the places that we see the nation state threat actors get really interested. And that's, largely because, when we start talking about kinetic conflict and, wars and that sort of thing, the bad guys want the ability to do things like turn the power off and jam cell phone networks and, enable the good guy, or I should say disable the good guy's ability to communicate. And that makes things sort of really interesting. And one of the things that I know the team has watched pretty closely is the Russian-Ukraine conflict, because it's always a bit of a canary as to what a nation state's going to do in a conflict against another nation state. And we've seen just that, right? Jamming of communication networks, taking down of power grids, that sort of thing. So it's been an interesting time period really over the past few years to be able to see that sort of in real time, because it's something that we've thought about, conceptually for quite a while.
Yeah, and what we've seen is that attacks on critical infrastructure as well that are paired with ransomware and supply chain compromise can be even more impactful, like Mike mentioned. And another thing about critical infrastructure that maybe not a lot of folks realize, is that a lot of critical infrastructure is actually owned and operated by these smaller to mid-sized businesses. And so those companies maybe don't have as strong of a cybersecurity program and the resources that larger institutions such as financial institutions may have. And so, that can be an easy way that threat actors can gain access to these systems, is because a lot of times some of these critical infrastructure, either organizations, if they're privately owned, or maybe even third-party suppliers to those organizations, are less well protected.
From what I saw, critical infrastructure was, some of these campaigns were highly aggressive in 2025. Do we think they're going to get more aggressive in 2026? And do we have any tips and tricks or thoughts about what the future is going to hold at the critical infrastructure level?
I just see the threat increasing over time. I mean, they've had a lot of success with it. We're talking about nation state threat actors in particular, but even cyber criminals, heavy target for ransomware. And oftentimes those cyber criminal groups are working at least tacitly with nation states to cause some disruptions in critical infrastructure. So I think in 2026, we'll see more of the same. If we look at critical infrastructure from a broader perspective as well, we've got, within the United States, we've got elections coming up. That's part of critical infrastructure. There used to be an election ISAC, Information Sharing and Analysis Center. That's been taken away. So, from a threat actor perspective, critical infrastructure in 2026 is even more vulnerable within the U.S. As far as how companies can protect themselves, I mean, if we look at how they get in the front door, you mentioned at the top of this, identity is a common theme. So a lot of it is just straight info stealers or phishing, getting credentials, getting their foot in the door. Usually the first thing we'll see when these threat actors get into these critical infrastructure or other government organizations or public sector organizations is grab credentials so that they can establish persistence and move laterally. So that's part of it. Protect your credentials. The other thing is, of course, patching. I mean, that's part of it. When we talk about any of these companies or talk to any of these companies, first two things we talk about are patching and passwords. Between, what we've just talked about, the identity and credential side, and the growing 0-day market. So you see nation state threat actors using 0 days to get their foot in the door. Those are the two key things that I think any organization can do.
It also leads me into this other topic of conversation about supply chain, another kind of basic, I think, foundational area of vulnerability. And we saw some, I think, very highly aggressive supply chain attacks. I'm thinking about the NPM compromise that happened this year. So, is this a new era of supply chain attacks? Are we entering into an escalated version of supply chain attacks after the NPM incident, like post-trust, where we just can't trust any of the third-party vendors that we work with? What do we think about that for 2026?
So the supply chain thing is really interesting because it's sort of it's like the golden ticket for the bad guys, right? When they can get something like NPM that's deployed on, potentially billions of computers, you've got the ability to do these massive compromises. I think one of the things, and we're going to talk a little bit more about AI, but I think one of the things that we'll probably start seeing is now as the AI systems get more capable and they're able to sort of sniff out some of those vulnerabilities and, the ability for the bad guys to put their malware and that sort of thing into places like NPM that can touch, many, many computers. We'll see more of that as those systems get a little bit more mature and they get a little bit more capable. But, we've seen the supply chain, especially in regards to, software update mechanisms. I mean, Struts is a great example, the Struts compromises over and over again. Those are all sort of play that part in, here's the golden ticket. Like, let me get access to this update utility or this, this base technology that all these systems use. And it just makes the bad guys' jobs easier. So yeah, I think we'll probably see an increase in it just based on some of the newer capabilities that are emerging.
It's worth examining the difference, or at least calling out the difference between the third-party vendor supply chain attacks and the open source software supply chain attacks, because I think there's two different aspects there. And with the open source supply chain attacks, I mean, really all supply chain attacks come down to return on investment. You can get a lot more if you pop into a supply chain, you get access to a lot more places very quickly. You automatically limit yourself a little bit more if you're working with a company that charges for access to their services. Whereas with the open source software supply chain attacks that we've seen this year, like you mentioned, NPM, there was Shai-Hulud 1 and Shai-Hulud 2 now just in the last few weeks. I mean, there's been countless other Python library supply chain attacks over the year. It's become so commonplace, but because, to Alex's point, you can get access to hundreds of thousands to millions to billions potentially of users by getting into that supply chain. So one of the things I think that 2025 has really called out and that we'll continue to see into 2026 is that focus of threat actors continuing to move, not necessarily away from third-party vendors. That's absolutely going to be part of it. I think of SolarWinds is a really good example of that. But this continued focus and increased focus on the open source supply chain.
Yeah, kind of a new attack surface that folks have to start paying attention to. Alex, you mentioned AI. I think it's a great segue. So obviously AI is transforming everything. It's changing, the world as we know it on a daily basis. How do we see it changing the landscape of potential threats in 2026? Is phishing going to get easier? Are threat actors going to be using this stuff?
Yeah, I mean, so one of the really interesting things about AI is, so I've in my career, I've been through a number of these like big technology shifts. So like initially, using Windows servers, and it had their share of issues with Windows servers. Then we went to virtualization, and everybody was after virtualization. And then we went to cloud, and everybody's doing cloud. And now we're to AI. The interesting thing about AI is the technology is moving so quickly that it's really hard to stay up to date and sort of keep track of what's going on. And when you think about the way that AI is being applied to almost every sort of system, you've got this huge new attack surface that people really haven't even considered. And the talk about the supply chain, or I'm sorry, the critical infrastructure, I thought was an interesting connection to AI too, because one of the things you see in the AI world is this massive interest in power because it's so power hungry, right? So you've got these foundation AI companies that are spending billions of dollars on data centers, billions of dollars on power systems. Google's talking about putting data systems and solar systems in space so they can, generate power and use and get access to the AI systems from space, right? So it's just this really crazy growing area of threat that we need to think about, and the critical infrastructure piece is going to play a part there. The other thing that's really interesting is, as what we typically see with the bad guys and the way that they move through a technology shift is they initially start poking around at it and they go, okay, this is kind of useful. And we saw that early on with AI where they're using, some of the chat systems to ask, how can I improve my attack methodology here? Help me write a script to do A, B, or C. What's a lure I can use for this particular company? Help me reword this phishing email so it makes sense. And then we start seeing a little bit more technical approach where they're using it to modify malware in real time and, doing some automated attack things. Anthropic recently posted a report around how they witnessed and defended against a agentic intrusion set where the bad guys used AI agents to sort of run the intrusion and do a bunch of things autonomously. So I think the AI piece is playing a huge part there, and as we see the traditional technology world adopt certain technologies, the bad guys do too. Another example I'll use that I think we're going to see an increase in is around deepfakes. One of the cutting edge uses of AI technology right now is to do like voice and video agents where you're interacting with somebody that you think is a person, but it's actually an AI agent. Imagine they do the same thing with a CEO from a bad guy perspective. Hey, it's Kareem. I'm the CEO of LastPass. Here's a video of me talking to you. Can you get me a gift card? Right. And go back to that sort of same initial greatest hits of the holiday season. So the technology, from an AI perspective is really making the bad guys able to do things that either were out of their reach previously or they had time constraints. If you think about, say I'm an exploit developer and I am spending 8 hours a day looking at source code, trying to figure out these exploits. I've got to sleep at some point. I've got to eat at some point. I've got to rest my brain at some point. If you train an AI agent to do something similar, it can work 24/7 until it finds what you want it to find, right? So it's just a question of scale and the ability to operate at machine speed that some of these systems are providing the bad guys. So a really interesting time to be watching that threat space.
Yeah, it's like marathon training on steroids, right? When you don't need to eat or sleep. You can just you can just keep attacking. Well, that wraps up another edition of the Phish Bowl 2026. It looks like it's going to be a wild ride, from new threats on the critical infrastructure front to reimagined supply chain attacks, and of course, AI always lurking over everybody's shoulder. I want to thank Mike and Steph, obviously, for their insights, and special guest Alex Cox, our resident threat futurologist, always has a unique perspective on the landscape. Be sure to like and subscribe wherever you listen to your podcast so you don't miss new episodes, and download the Threat Report, which has all of these great insights all in one place. The link, which will be in the episode description. My name is Jordan. I love seeing you all. I will see you next time. And until then, have a great new year. Thanks, everybody.